Imagine you're a UFC fighter, and from the moment you've stepped inside the octagon, you've been finishing fighters left and right. And before you know it, you're undisputed champion in your division. So the UFC decides to give you one of the highest honors there is for anyone in combat sports. You get to be on the cover of the new UFC game. You don't know it yet, but this is where your downfall begins. You have fallen victim to the UFC Cover Curse. In its entire history, there have been 6 UFC games, and in each game, every single athlete who had the honor of being on the cover was either cursed with losses, injury, or even in certain cases, legal problems. So let's dive in and see how each athlete was affected by EA. The very first UFC game came out in 2014 and it featured Jon Jones and Alexander Gustafsson. Alexander Gustafsson at the time was fighting in the light heavyweight division and he had gone on a 6-fight win streak, only losing to fellow UFC cover athlete Jon Jones in the fight for the UFC light heavyweight title. Mind you, he was still the number 1 ranked contender, but after appearing on the UFC cover, he was knocked out for the first time ever in his career and suffered multiple losses after that. He had 2 more title shots, one against DC and the other against Jon Jones for the second time, but he never won the belt and eventually retired in 2022 after a 4-fight lose streak. However, with Jon Jones, he actually ended up going a different direction and actually won his next 3 fights after getting featured on the cover. He won twice against DC and once against Ovince St. Preux for the light heavyweight title. All things were going good for Jon, right? Wrong. This part of Jones's career was probably the worst ever. He originally defended his title against DC the first time, but was stripped of the title after violating athlete conduct policy. The violation? He was involved in a multi-car hit-and-run accident in New Mexico that injured a pregnant woman. Yikes. When he won against Preux, he was once again stripped after a failed drug test, and just when you think all is over, his second fight against DC, he once again ended up winning, but again, the UFC stripped him of the title after he tested positive for a banned substance again. So in that time period, after getting featured on the UFC cover, he got his belt stripped 3 times consecutively. While he was one of the greatest athletes to ever grace the sport, his curse was that because of all these controversies, he isn't the undisputed greatest of all time among MMA fans, and perhaps he would be had it not been for his failed drug tests or legal issues. Moving on to UFC 2, which came out in 2015. The cover athletes were Ronda Rousey and Conor McGregor. Both Rousey and McGregor were respectively on the top of their game, both going on insane win streaks. Ronda was undefeated at 11-0, whereas McGregor was an up-and-coming face of the sport as he was tearing up the featherweight division. The curse took place on both fighters when Ronda Rousey suffered back-to-back knockout losses, one by Holly Holm and the other by Amanda Nunes. After that, she was just never the same. The losses affected her so bad she even contemplated suicide and didn't return to MMA until 10 years later. Meanwhile, McGregor had actually managed to beat Chad Mendes and Jose Aldo, unifying the featherweight title shortly after the game's release. However, the curse struck him as well. He recorded his first ever UFC loss to Nate Diaz via submission. Now, while granted McGregor jumped 2 weight classes and managed to defeat him in the second fight, he was still the favorite against Diaz, and that loss is still extremely shocking to this day. Next, we move on to UFC 3, which came out in 2018 and it featured Conor McGregor once again. At this time period, he was holding titles in both the featherweight and the lightweight division, but he was also very inactive at this time because of his blockbuster fight with Floyd Mayweather, so he made a fat bag and had no reason to fight anymore. So the UFC had both his belts stripped since he was holding up both divisions for nearly 2 years. But naturally, McGregor was still McGregor, so after his beef with Khabib escalated, the UFC gave him a title fight and naturally, he was submitted in round 4. And this loss absolutely broke him as he was just never the same after that. Conor's career took a major downfall where after a long hiatus, he lost twice to Dustin Poirier, the first time getting knocked out and the second time breaking his leg, which sidelined him for almost 5 years. Well, that is until now. Next, on to UFC 4, which came out in 2020. The cover athletes were Israel Adesanya and Jorge Masvidal. Now, these guys were in their absolute prime, I tell you. Jorge Masvidal was an up-and-coming name in the welterweight division as he had defeated Darren Till, Donald Cerrone, and naturally, of course, the infamous fastest ever knockout against Ben Askren.
The fight clock is brought to you by Modelo.
His personality was elite and his trash talk was fiery, just what the division needed. So naturally, the UFC made a matchup against Nate Diaz for the BMF belt. And Masvidal beat the ever-living shit out of Diaz and he won the BMF via doctor stoppage. Now, Izzy, on the other hand, was undefeated. He was 19-0 and quickly becoming a problem in the middleweight division. However, the curse hit both fighters. Masvidal was given a title shot against Kamaru Usman shortly after the game released, and he lost the first time via unanimous decision. And he was given an immediate rematch. Well, he got brutally knocked out and cursed with having Herb, if he dies Dean, refereeing the match.
Of all the superlatives.
He then went on to lose to Colby Covington and Gilbert Burns. And after that, my man just retired from the sport and booked a one-way trip to Turkey to fix that god-awful hairline. As for Izzy, shortly after the game released, he lost his undefeated record when he moved up to light heavyweight to fight Han Blachowicz for the light heavyweight title. He failed to become a double champ and moved down to middleweight, where he defended the belt 3 more times before losing to Pereira and then winning it back again in the rematch. Next, we move on to UFC 5, which came out in 2023, and the cover athletes were Valentina Shevchenko and Alexander Volkanovski. It also featured Izzy again in the deluxe edition of the game. Now, Volk at the time was tearing up the featherweight division, and I personally think he is the greatest featherweight of all time, but unfortunately he got cursed when he suffered back-to-back losses. One was with the rematch with Islam Makhachev for the lightweight title, which he took on short notice, and, well,
figured to be a tough proposition.
After that, he got knocked out again and went on to lose the featherweight belt to Ilia Topuria. This time wasn't a good time for Volk, but he's back again, back-to-back wins against Lopez. He's still not completely washed, since that was just a minor bump in his illustrious career. As for Izzy, well, yeah, let's not talk about Izzy. Finally, we move on to UFC 6, which came out earlier this year. Cover athletes being Alex Pereira and Max Holloway in the deluxe edition of the game. And it seems that the cover curse has already hit for Alex Pereira when he missed out on the chance to become a 3-division champion when he lost to Cyril Gane in the fight for the interim heavyweight title. As for Max, he already lost the BMF belt to Charles, and he has another matchup against McGregor this week at welterweight. Let's see if the curse lives on. But after all that, I think that the real curse was that even with 6 games, EA is absolutely incapable of making a single decent UFC game where there isn't multiple game bugs, a completely overpowered flow state mechanic, and not even a proper likeness for fighters. But that's all for now. See you in the next video. Subscribe.